yeah, there was a spot where we landed, and I'm not exaggerating, less than 20 feet away from the skid, like fully exposed, like a collection of bones, like in the rock, but you can see plain as day without digging or anything, just laying there.
Welcome to 10-Minute Travels. With me, as always, is Shane Patrick.
And with me, as always, is Phil Freeman. Tonight we're going to be talking with Ryan Skorecki, helicopter pilot, flown all over the world. If you want to learn more about him or other things we talk about at 10-Minute Travels, check us out at 10minutetravels.com.
Let's get right to it, shall we? Is McMurdo the largest base on Antarctica?
It is, yeah. So right next to us we have the Kiwi base. That one's much smaller. Then about 200 miles north, there's an Italian base and a Korean base. They're both much smaller.
How many people, more or less?
I bet the Italians, I bet it's 50 or less. So we have like a full-blown maintained ice runway. So what happens is, like, every year when the Italians come down to open up because the Italians that base isn't manned year round. So it gets shut down for the winter. So when the Italians want to reopen their base, they come down, but their runway, the ice runway for them, is not prepped, right? Because no one's been there all winter. So they'll actually land at McMurdo, and if it typically happens that where we'll fly them up, so they'll land, and then we'll get two 212s with a bunch of their people and fly up there, drop them off, and then they'll heat up their buildings, and their helicopters spend the winter there, like inside. So they'll push their helicopters outside, and then the next day those helicopters will fly down and pick up all their gear, and then from that point on, then they can maintain their own runway and get it prepped so that the planes can land there instead of McMurdo. So McMurdo ends up being like a launching point for multiple different other countries' bases. So because at McMurdo we'll have some ski-equipped C-130s, and then some Baslers, these big DC, World War II vintage DC-3 airplanes that have been that have retractable ski wheels and pretty powerful piston engines put on to replace the old radial engines, and then some Twin Otters. And so between those three types of planes, they'll get used to shuttle people all over the continent. They'll go to the South Pole and beyond.
Have you been to the South Pole?
The closest I got was 199 miles away. We did a project the year before last out on the Shackleton Glacier, and we had a fuel cache. So we were moving. There was a whole bunch of different science was happening at that camp. And some of the more interesting stuff was these dinosaur hunters, and it was cool. Like, some of the coolest stuff I've seen. And, like, there was one spot where we landed where there's just full-on fossilized trees, like, everywhere. It looked like a forest, but it's all rock. Tens of millions of years old. And the same trees, it's all from when that part of Antarctica was connected to Africa. And of course they've drifted apart over time. But so yeah, remarkable. And so and then we flew a bit further with the dinosaur hunting crew, and yeah, there was a spot where we landed, and I'm not exaggerating, less than 20 feet away from the skid, like fully exposed, like a collection of bones, like in the rock, but you can see plain as day without digging or anything, just laying there.
Wow. Whoa.
Yeah, that is really cool.
That's a dream come true for a paleontologist, isn't it?
Yeah. So one of the other science groups that was operating on that same camp was one of these meteorite hunting. So NASA, another big NASA project that happens down there, is this meteorite hunting group. And at first, the guy who came up with the idea was laughed at, but he stuck with the idea, and he proved the meteorite hunting community wrong. And in one season, he came back after years of fighting to get funding to do it. He went to Antarctica. He identified these zones where these massive ice sheets converge into an ablation zone. And the thinking is these glaciers aren't near any rocks. So any rock, you got, millions and millions of square miles of area catching anything that falls from the sky, and it's all going to get moved to this particular spot, and then the ice is going to ablate away. And so that's a likely spot to look for meteorites. And he was right, So anyway, the project has been going on for years. Every year NASA sends people down and they look. And so before they put up a full-blown camp somewhere, they'll send out these little scouting parties who will, it's typically a much smaller group, and they will, they identify some zones from satellite imagery, and then they'll send like a test team out to do like an initial survey to determine if they want to put a full-blown camp out there in the future. So we were moving around one of these like feeler groups. They were just hitting a couple different spots to determine if they want to, devote resources into putting a full-blown camp there in the future. And the spot where these guys happened to be was, it was just under 200 miles from the South Pole. And so I remember pleading with my boss, like, come on, this is as cheap as it will ever be for us to get there. We already have a fuel cache. It's right here. We can make it.
How long would it take the 200 miles to fly one way?
2 hours. Which is, and we carry 2.5 hours of gas. So, we'd fly the 2 hours, we could refuel there and fly back. And I was like, yeah, come on, can you imagine the publicity shots we'd get, like the 212s with the pole? There's a pole, I don't know if you've seen the marker, but it's a pole that comes out of the ground with a big silver ball, like a very reflective silver ball, And yeah, that'd be the shot, the 212s and that marker right in front of it. But the powers that be said no, it wasn't worth the risk, which I can understand. Like if something happens,
so close.
But yeah, so I didn't make it to the South Pole, but got within 200 miles. And now it's unlikely to ever happen again. Like we won't have that. The only reason why it would have made sense is because that fuel cache was there, because that NASA group was there, But we won't do it again. The airplanes go to the South Pole all the time. And then even more interesting is they used to get fuel to the South Pole, they used to fly it in C-130s. It was horribly inefficient. A C-130 would basically fill its tank, fly to the South Pole, pump out as much fuel as it could while still having enough to get back to McMurdo. And so they would do that a lot, hundreds of times, to fuel the base. It's like terribly wasteful. And then at some point years ago, someone came up with the idea, like, why don't we just drag it, big bladders to the South Pole. And
with cats?
Yeah.
Cats?
They have this plastic sleds that are made out of this, they call it HMW, high molecular weight plastic. It's super slippery. It's amazingly slippery. You try and stand on it and it's amazingly slippery.
Is it that stuff that the Griswolds had on that sled?
Yeah. And so yeah, they put tens of thousands of gallons of fuel and bladders on these things, and they drive it to the South Pole. So they call it SPOT, the South Pole Traverse. So they do it spot 1, 2, and 3. So a good year they'll do it 3 times. And
is there a full-time base down there at the South Pole?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's manned year-round?
Year-round, yeah.
Wow.
A whole bunch of atmospheric science happens there. And then other projects, that becomes like a launching off point for lots of other projects. Which, the thought of being in a field camp. But, the South Pole, it's almost, it's like 10,000 feet. And it's super cold. The thought of camping in a tent in those kind of temperatures.
At 10,000 feet?
Not really all that exciting. But a lot of science happens there. Yeah. McMurdo's much more hospitable. Once we get into late December, early January, it's significantly warmer in McMurdo than it would be here. I'm not running around in a t-shirt, but I would be wearing, pants with no long johns and a real thin jacket outside.
So, 30s?
Yeah. Right at freezing. But it's so dry that it just really doesn't feel that cold. And if the sun's out, then it feels warm. There'll be there's liquid water flowing in the town, and you wouldn't think, but there is.
And then I'm sure you've gotten used to it too, so 30 feels like 50 or whatever.
Yeah, probably.
So 8 years you've done there, is that right?
This will be number 8 and 7.
That was Ryan Skorecki, helicopter pilot extraordinaire. If you want to learn more about him or anything else we talked about at 10 Minute Travels, check us out at 10minutetravels.com.
And we want to remind you to make sure that your sense of humor matches your sense of adventure.
And please like, subscribe, and share this podcast on all the platforms.